Why do you think design thinking is sweeping the business world right now?
Well, I mean, the short, cynical answer is that it makes them money. But I mean, that's the real answer. I mean, it
So it
makes money. It
works.
works. Yeah.
Okay, I mean,
Um,
that's a good reason. Welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm your host, tech entrepreneur, executive coach, and Chicago Booth MBA, Sophia Matliova. My aim here is to help you have a great career in the digital age. In a time when even your coffee shop has an app, you simply have to speak tech. On this podcast, I share core technology concepts, help you relate them to business outcomes, and most importantly, share practical advice on what you can do to become a digital leader today. If you want to have a great career in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Hello, smart people. How are you today? I am in London and the city is really fun at this time of year, but oh my God, I tell you, I am really missing the sun. I'm beginning to think that there is some sort of new ruthless immigration policy, and basically the sun could not get a visa. Must be it, right? In today's episode, you are going to learn from John Mauriello. John is an industrial designer by training, and if you don't know what industrial design is, you're going to learn about it today. And I want you to learn this because there's actually quite a lot that as a business leader you can learn from industrial design. John also has a really good YouTube channel called Design Theory, and his videos are watched by literally millions of people. I discovered his work through the YouTube algorithm, and then I watched several of his videos, and I wanted to bring him on here so you could learn from him too, because I love you and I want you to succeed. Speaking of succeeding, have you got your early bird ticket for Design for Growth yet? If the title of this episode attracted your attention, then you will love the Design for Growth program. I see it as a kind of 2-in-1 situation. The program begins with a deep dive into design thinking principles, which will be covered by me, and a really cool lead designer, so you can ask a lead designer your questions so that material can really sink in. And once you've really mastered design thinking principles, you will then use them to create a plan of action for 2024. You can use the Design for Growth program to create a new product, to launch or grow a venture, or to transform your career. And I have used design thinking for all three, so I know that it works. The most important part of the Design for Growth program is a live workshop which will take place on the 28th of January. And the whole program is going to be in a small group, so you'll really get to meet and interact with some very smart people. As well as the live workshop on design thinking in January, you're also going to get a class on how to get headhunted so you can make opportunities come to you. And we'll do that in February. And this is really important because most jobs do not get advertised. And I've seen studies that say about 80% of jobs don't get advertised. So that's why knowing how to get opportunities to come to you is super important. This entire program is online, so you can grow your network and learn new skills without leaving your house. What is not to like? And there's also a bunch of bonus resources and even a swag bag. I'm really proud of this program. It will be a perfect way for you to learn a vital new skill set for the digital age and to begin your year with an ambitious and realistic plan. So make sure to get the early bird rate before it runs out. The link for Design for Growth is in the show notes, or just go to techfornontechies.co/events and see all the information there. And now, let's learn from the wonderful and knowledgeable John Mauriello, host of the Design Theory channel. Hello, John, and welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm so happy that you're here.
yeah, me too. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk with you.
So I discovered your YouTube channel and I have been binge watching it. And so I learned lots and lots of things from it. And I see that you are an industrial designer, but you cover lots and lots of different design topics. So I'd like to find out first, what is an industrial designer?
Probably the simplest way to explain it is that it's like architecture, but for little things. Um, to expand on that a little bit, it's essentially just designing consumer products in a way that is really usable and beautiful and making them function well and look nice and sort of embody a brand's values. So that would be the short summary of it. There are a lot of steps involved in that process, but that's the basic definition.
So when you said it's designed for little things, does this mean that, my fancy pen is going to be made by an industrial designer as well as, something a bit bigger? I don't know, I'm thinking my fridge, my wardrobe, would that also be an industrial designer?
So here's the thing. You don't necessarily need an industrial designer to make a product. In fact, a lot of commodities typically do not use them. However, things that have sort of a higher bar for quality often use them. And another thing that's important to remember is that industrial design can be applied to a wide variety of things. So I have designed industrial equipment, for example. I have designed pens, actually. I have designed food truck interiors. I have designed computers, tablets, cell phones, eyeglasses, faucets, pretty much any physical thing benefits greatly from having some kind of design work that focuses on sort of understanding the user's needs first and foremost. So I think the biggest differentiator between a designer and most other people in the company is that they're going to be far more focused on the user experience more so than other people. Not to say that other people don't care about that, but that's going to be their primary concern.
On your channel, you talk about all these different types of design. So there are, I think there's something on design thinking. There are differences in cultures, how different cultures approach design. So I'd love to learn from you. What are the different types of design in general that are out there? Broadly speaking, I know that that's a big question. We could be here forever, but essentially just what out of what people might know. Because what I'm concerned about is the audience thinking that design is about either making pretty logos or about making dresses. And design
Right.
is obviously important there too, but I do want people to understand that there are other aspects and that also design can be a way of management as well.
Yeah. I mean, the way that it's approached right now, currently, is more a methodology for solving problems. I'm not sure if that's like almost too broad to be helpful, and I'm also not sure if that's the best way to think about design. But to answer your question, I mean, logos and fashion are a part of design, but really it's sort of about understanding what the user's needs are and improving on an experience from there. And that can mean a lot of things. If you'd like, I can give you some concrete examples. Maybe that would be easier.
Yes,
What do you
please.
think about that? Okay, we can talk about the Multipla, the Fiat Multipla. So that was designed by, I believe his name is Roberto Giolito. He was a designer at Fiat, and he designed the Multipla, and the brief was completely insane. I think they needed to fit, it was either 5 or 6 people inside of a vehicle, as well as their luggage. So it was supposed to be like primarily a human transport, like a taxi, essentially. So he had to figure out, like, okay, how do we fit 6 people in this tiny vehicle package that engineering has sort of given to us? Although they probably collaborated with engineering in developing the chassis and the vehicle package as well. How do we fit 6 people in this thing and their luggage into something that is basically smaller than a Honda Civic by, like, a foot or a couple feet, I think, basically almost a meter? That would be an example of, like, sort of solving engineering constraints, usability constraints, and aesthetic constraints. Now, in that particular instance, the Multipla is famous for being really, really ugly. However, so that's where they sort of decided to sacrifice. They just decided to sacrifice aesthetics for basically good experience and usability. One really special thing about the Multipla, and I haven't sat in one, but I have a friend who has, my good friend Rafi. When you sit in that thing, it's like you can see the whole world around you. The visibility is spectacular. And it's amazing because the car is so tiny that, you can fit 6 people in it, but it doesn't feel cramped at all, in spite of how small it is and being able to fit that many people in it. So that would be an example of sort of balancing all of the constraints of cost, business, design, usability, aesthetics, to create a good product. The Fiat Multipla is actually a really good example of that. It's funny because the Multipla actually has a cult following now, and it was made fun of a lot when it first came out. But the sales of it weren't bad because it did solve the user's needs. So a lot of people made fun of it, but I think sales wise, it performed okay. And interestingly, when they changed the look, I think sales went down. Now, maybe that's the natural sort of progression of the vehicle because it had already been out for a few years. But that is kind of interesting to think about. And I mean, look, you can do all sorts of things with design. I mean, I've designed much smaller scale projects as well, like a pen. It's like, okay, is it weighted properly? Is it comfortable to hold? How do we balance all of the constraints around cost, um, assembly in the factory, all that kind of stuff? Does that help answer your question?
Yes, that does help answer my question. And I think that idea of the car, that essentially there were so many, the problem was stated quite clearly that this is a vehicle that needs to transport this number of people with luggage. Okay, so we understand this problem. We understand how designers then work within constraints to solve that problem. And so continuing with this idea that design is a methodology for solving problems. This is what I'm seeing in the business world. The business world right now is getting more and more obsessed with design thinking. Could you tell us a little bit what your definition is of design thinking?
Let me talk a little bit more about what that means in practical terms. So typically design thinking involves understanding the customer journey, usually through ethnographic interviews. So you'll speak with customers in a very specific way, so that you don't lead them, because that's something that a lot of people have an inclination towards, and understanding sort of the psychological decision making. To be clear, you don't really ask them like, oh, how do we design a better pen, for example. I'm just making this up. You wouldn't really ask that, but you'd ask them like, oh, tell me a little bit about when you use this. How do you use it? Can you walk me through a day in the life of using this thing? Ideally, you could actually follow them around and see when they use the device that you're designing for. And then, maybe how does this fit into a larger ecosystem? When do you decide to use a tablet or a phone or a computer versus your pen? What is the benefit of that? What kind of paper do you write on? Do you write on paper? What else do you write on? All these kinds of things sort of give you a broader understanding of what the customer is doing, which then allows you to sort of create insights that allow for better designs, essentially designs that people actually want to use and buy. So the most important thing that I want you to take away from this is that design thinking is not so much about, or design research is not so much about asking the customer what they want, although you can do that. You usually won't get very good answers. It's more about understanding their psychology and their deeper needs in order to create something that actually solves the real underlying problem rather than the surface level issue that they might tell you. That's another thing. A lot of times you might interview someone during a design interview, or you might observe them doing a task, and they might say that they have no problem doing something. Like, for example, I was designing food truck interiors, and they're so used to the problems that they have to contend with every day that they don't even see them as problems every day at all. They don't see them as problems. So, for example, this is sort of a known thing in cooking, or like in a kitchen, and in a kitchen of any size. Anytime you have to take one step in one direction or another, it immediately, like, efficiency just plummets. And all of a sudden, you're focused on moving around the space rather than actually cooking effectively. Cooks are good at cooking, and that's what they want to be doing. They don't want to be struggling to move around the space. But over time, they sort of get used to the hardships associated with it, in spite of the efficiency being way, way down, and them making more mistakes, and them just creating more stress for themselves as a result of these problems. You see this a lot in a lot of professional fields where they're like, oh, yeah, everything that I use is great. And then you actually watch them use it and you see them struggle with it. That's another thing. This applies to relationships and life as well. Always focus on what people do. Don't worry so much about what they say. Very important when it comes to design thinking and design research. That's why that firsthand observation is so important. Because people might say, I just had a user interview yesterday. This person said one thing and they actually did something quite literally completely the opposite. So I started with just asking them a few questions, and then I asked them to show me what they do in this particular process for this design, and it was completely different.
And so Why do you think design thinking is sweeping the business world right now? CEOs are talking about it. I know the CEO of Logitech says that the former CEO of Logitech says that it was design thinking that helped him turn the company around and have increased the market cap by 10 times. So it is definitely in vogue. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, the short, cynical answer is that it makes them money. But I mean, that's the real answer. I mean, it
So it
makes money. It
works.
works. Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
Um,
that's a good reason. I don't think
yeah.
that's a cynical reason. I
And
think that's a great
it
one.
won't necessarily work for every company in every situation, to be clear. But for Logitech, it worked really, really well. And I think their philosophy more specifically, I don't know what their process is. I did do some contract work for them, but that was in like 2012, I think, or around 2012. So I was not involved in any of uh, that stuff. They were starting to think about how to turn the company around. But anyway, look, the bottom line is, with Logitech, their main methodology that works for them is like, okay, what is the one thing that this product has to do? So, that has a lot of benefits because it forces you to stay focused and be ruthlessly efficient with how you're going to prioritize. That worked for Logitech. It might not work for other companies. It just depends. But it's like, okay, is any feature that we add going to be in service of this one thing that this thing needs to do? So, for example, if it's a computer mouse, I actually have a Logitech mouse. I kind of destroyed it. I don't know if you can see.
Oh,
I
wow.
wanted to see how deep the this co-molded rubber piece went for another project that I'm working on. It's like 2 or 3 millimeters. Anyway, the point is, I have a Logitech mouse. I bet you the one thing that this had to do was to
Mhm.
be comfortable to use, and ideally, they had a criteria for how long they wanted this thing to be used. Like, the more concrete you can be, the better. So it's like, okay, I want this to be usable by a person for 8 to 10 hours working at their desk, with minimal interruptions or breaks. So what
Mhm.
they did was they basically made it so that this allows you to have a very straight wrist while using it. Most other
Mhm.
mice force you to sort of pronate your wrist like this, which is
Mhm.
not ideal. So that would be an example of like, okay, the one thing that this thing needs to do is somebody needs to be able to comfortably use this for 8 to 10 hours. And I'm making that, but I have no idea. But I bet you the criteria was something very similar to that. Anything that's not in service of that, you take it out. You don't. It's not a feature that's relevant or important. Anything that's in service of it, you keep it in. That's a really, really effective and simple way to sort of prioritize. Because a lot of times with businesses, it's really, really hard to stay focused, especially because a lot of companies have competing interests. Sales might have a completely different motivation from engineering or accounting. Um, they might have a complete engineering might have something a completely different idea of what constitutes a good product compared to design. So if you can kind of get everybody on the same page, that's great, assuming that it's in the right direction. Of course, you can get everybody on the same page and go in the complete wrong direction, like the Pontiac Aztec. I have another video about that. It's funny if you, the Aztec was actually kind of innovative in a lot of ways, but it was a little bit ahead of its time. And I think another big contributing factor to its demise was, well, it looked ridiculous, and it was right around the early 2000s. Like, I believe it came out in 2000 or 2001, and that was right around when internet meme culture came to be a thing. And I think the marketing team just did not anticipate the onslaught of insults and mass meme attacks that were a result of that car. But that's a whole nother conversation. I
It's
know
a
I
good
tend to
video. I
go off
watched
on
it.
these tangents, but yeah. To answer your question, basically, one thing that a lot of companies employ is sticking to a singular user-driven vision. So, like, what's going to be best for the customer, and that is one technique. I'm trying to look past that, though. I think that there is. So, look, here's the reality of business. When you have hundreds of people in a corporation, you got to keep the message simple. But I'm trying to think of ways to add more nuance to it, and I haven't figured that out yet. But it's something that I'm trying to work on.
I'm curious. I don't know the answer to this, but I am genuinely curious why this whole focus on the user, essentially focus on the customer, why it's such a revolutionary thing, right? Because, okay, maybe people who are running a Fortune 100 company are going to forget about it. But if you're running a startup, you have to be super focused on the customers because basically, if you don't give them what they want, they're not going to pay you. And So I'm really, when I think about design thinking, I don't know if I'm what I'm missing, but when I look at it, I'm like, well, isn't it obvious? Focus on the people who are going to give you money, and then they'll give you more of it.
I wish it was that simple. So you have to remember, a lot of founders are not customer focused, and that's okay. They're geniuses in their own way. But a lot of them are technical founders. They might be engineers. They developed a really cool technology, and it's like, all right, now we have to figure out who's going to use this thing. And they have no connection or interest in the customer. Their interest is in technology and creating new cool stuff, which is fine. That's very important. I mean, you can't. All of these technological innovations are what uh, allow for design innovation. So I'm not saying that those people are bad or anything, but you'd be surprised. I work in Silicon Valley. There are people who have raised millions and millions of dollars at Silicon Valley tech startups who have never spoken to a customer just because they have a good technology. They were able to sell it to venture capitalists. And yeah, they've never ever spoken to a customer, which is absolutely insane to me. Here's another interesting thing. A lot of them are resistant to even speaking to customers at all or even understanding the use case.
And is
That's
that
a
just
really
because it's
crazy one.
scary? I mean, is it literally just a, rejection? Because if you make a thing and you speak to a customer and the customer's going to say, well, you know what, to be honest, it's not my favorite thing. If you've made it, nobody wants to hear that. Is it literally just fear?
It could be. One thing to remember is that founders, if they're the ones doing the interviewing, they cannot be even close to objective about it. So you almost never want a founder in a user interview because they're going to completely botch it. Um, Unless they have incredible restraint. I haven't seen it personally. Um, I think I would have a really hard time dealing with it. If I had this thing that I had been working on for years, I developed this technology. I have a PhD. I'm at the top of my field, and then I have to listen to some peon, in their view. I have to listen to some lowly customer tell me what they think about my genius innovation. It's like, are you kidding me? Um, One thing you have to remember is also that they think that's actually more the mindset. It's not so much fear, it's more arrogance, I think, a lot of the time. It's like, what could they possibly tell me about
Mm-hmm.
the customer? What do they have to offer me? I'm the one who made this thing. I know it's best. It works fine for me. Now, of course, that has its own set of problems. Of course, it works for you because you're the one who designed it or developed the system. You'll see this a lot with engineering stuff. They're like, oh yeah, it works perfectly fine. You just press this button and then you go over here and then you recalibrate and then you flip it 90 degrees and then you just hold your hand a certain way and it works. What's the big deal? These customers are so stupid. Now, to be clear, most people aren't like this. Most of my clients are really, really smart and really nice and really empathetic uh to their end customer, just to be really clear. But there are people like this for sure.
So I recently actually was on the other end of that, where there was a founder, a technical founder who had created this thing, and it's somebody that I know and like. And so they basically said, can you try it and then talk to me and give me some feedback, give me some advice. And so I tried it, and I couldn't understand what it was. And I was really trying because I really liked the guy, I wanted to help. And I was trying, and I was still like, I think it's something to do with finance, but this is this is it. And when I said, I don't really understand it, and because I don't understand it, I expect other people will have some issues with it too. And I said it very politely, but he was really unhappy. And essentially, the feedback that I got was that I was stupid and it works, and their customers are much more educated, and that it's like, well, our customers are going to be very sophisticated and they're going to understand it, and you don't. And so I walked away being like, oh, okay, well, thanks. Thank you for telling me I'm a moron. That was very nice of you.
He's in for a rude awakening. It's going to be tough when he launches that product. Oh man, I hope he figures it out in time. Wait, don't you have a business background though?
Yes, I mean, I have an MBA. I have an MBA from
So if
Chicago.
you can't figure it out, then what hope does basically anybody else have?
Well, that's what I was saying to him, because I said to him that, well, I worked in a private equity firm, which is, finance. And and I've literally studied finance and economics at a really, really, really high level.
And so did he. And so he went to, I mean, I'm not going to say because I don't want to identify this person, but he went to like one of the top schools, worked in a top bank. And so that's why he wanted me to have a look at it. And I was just, I don't know what this is, but I want it to leave me alone.
He buried the lead. You ever heard that term in journalism?
No.
It's when you do so much research into something and you are so deep into it that you've completely lost what the initial sort of point of the article was, or in this case, what the point of the product is. So he probably has a very nuanced and deep understanding of what he's doing, and that is actually to his detriment.
Interesting.
So,
so actually, this is what I was wondering about, because you said that you have, designed a pen, you've designed the interior of a food truck, and so on and so forth. And so, do designers specialize in a specific like type of object, or is it better to kind of not be a specialist? Because if you're a specialist, you end up creating what this gentleman that I was describing created, which is something so complicated, only he knows what it is.
I think it depends. A lot of designers specialize in one of two ways. They either, well, there's probably three. Number one, and this is from my friend Ryan Hume. He came up with this sort of this trifecta. So basically, number one is you can specialize into a certain product category. So for example, pens or eyewear or consumer electronics or whatever. Another thing you can do is you can specialize in a certain skill. So, for example, maybe you specialize in front end research. Maybe you specialize in design thinking. Maybe you specialize in concept sketching or 3D visualization, whatever it might be. And then the third thing is sort of being more of a strategic connector. So, how do you sort of understand the goals of the business and translate that into designs? I mostly fall into the third one. But that is still a specialization, if that makes sense. So yeah, does that answer your question?
I forgot my question, but this was a good answer. So can you tell me why you chose that specialization?
Because the context is far more rich and far more broad. It can be really fun to just focus on like the little tiny details of like a consumer electronic and really understanding the nature of the refresh rates and how a person presses down a button on the side of a phone. But it's just at the beginning of the career, that's a lot of what I did, just like really, really specialized, very specific, very detail oriented work. But after a while, it's just a little bit too tunnel vision for me. You kind of, it's kind of like, okay, do I really need to spend the next month refining the foot of the MacBook Pro? Like, do I want to do this? For some people, the answer is yes, but it was not the answer for me. And just to be clear, those people are really, really smart. Like they're geniuses working on these little tiny problems, and you take these little things for granted. Like the microphone in front of you, there are teams of people who have spent years and years of their life sort of amassing insane amounts of knowledge and then applying that to a product, working with people halfway across the world to actually get it manufactured, and then to get it manufactured consistently is even more amazing. So I'm not trying to say that like that those people that job is easy or that those people are like less than or anything like that. They're absolute geniuses at what they do. It's just not where my interest was as I progressed through my career. That's all.
And so now you said that you connect the business goals to design. Could you go into that? Like, what is that in practice?
Yeah. So it's hard to. I'd have to give a specific example. And it's tough because once again, there's the NDA constraints. But
if I would could a business goal be like, okay, we need to next year in 2024, we need to increase profitability by, I don't know, 50%. Is that the kind of business goal that you could help with? Because, if you can, come over here.
Yeah, 50%. Yeah, good luck. I mean, sure, I can try. I can't guarantee that, but I think
you said design thinking works. I'm hopeful.
It does work. I said it works in certain situations. 50% profitability by next year. I mean, geez, look, the bottom line is there are a lot of moving parts to any business. So I think that's kind of what I focus on rather than sort of working in a vacuum of just designing the product. I try and think of the more holistic sort of system for how it fits within the larger ecosystem. So more specifically, it's like, all right, who are all of the customers involved with making this purchasing decision? You think it's the end customer. Okay, sure. That is true. But a lot of B2B products, there are multiple purchasing decisions being made. Maybe if I think I mentioned this to you before, or I might have mentioned it in a video, I can't remember which, but it's like, okay, this is an example from, I believe, Don Norman in his book, Design of Everyday Things.
We just had an episode on that. Yeah.
What's
I
that?
love that book. We just had an episode on that. Yeah.
It's a great book. Yeah. So he mentioned copy machines. And when you buy a copy machine, like the purchasing decision of a copy machine is made usually by an office manager. And a lot of times the office manager doesn't have to use the copy machine. And their incentive structure is specifically centered around making sure that they save on business expenses. They save on price. So they're going to buy the cheapest copy machine that they possibly can. And to hell with the users, because who cares? I get my Christmas bonus if I, keep the budget down. So that would be an example of something that's really hard to design for, because it's like you have to make it as cheap as possible. And the person making the decision and actually buying is not the end user. And that would be an example of something that's really important. And a lot of designers will just focus on making the nicest copy machine experience possible, but there's a lot more nuance to it than that. So that would be one example. It's like, okay, who's going to buy this? Another thing is, what is the messaging in this space? Is it a commodified thing, or is there a lot of branding involved in it? Is there a lot of branding and messaging and marketing involved in it? Just sort of understanding the bigger picture is really important. And that's like one concrete example, the copy machine example.
That's really interesting. Also, it makes me think of toys, right? Because the person who's going to be using the product, the child, is not going to be the person who's paying for the product and who's deciding whether the child should have the product. So then you're in this annoying situation of it's got to be entertaining. It's also got to be fashionable amongst, 7-year-olds who are a very picky crowd, but also it probably has to have some sort of, wholesome educational element. So parents actually pay for it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you'll see this with a lot of software as well. It's like, okay, if it's like a consumer app, like, I don't know, any sort of, like if it's not B2B basically, and it's something that, and it's an app that somebody uses for their own enjoyment. It's like the reason people use it might be one reason, but the way that you make money from it might be something completely different. And the way that you might make money might be at odds with the person's enjoyment of using it. That's when it gets really difficult. It's like, well, there are tons of examples of this. The most obvious one is YouTube. It's like, okay, well, they make money from ads. The more ads you show, the less positive the user experience is going to be. How do you balance those two things? So it's really, really tricky with a lot of things. Another thing is just understanding the actual customer journey. So what are all of the steps involved, and what are the most painful parts of the process of using a product or a service? That's another really important thing. So it's not just about the end object. It's about the entire process of using it, including the parts that don't necessarily directly involve it. So for example, let's say you're designing something for patients with diabetes. It's like, okay, I've been tasked with designing, let's just say, I don't know, some kind of tool or device. I don't actually know much about diabetes. I'm designing a device for diabetes. It's like, all right, well, what else do they have to think about? How do they think about their diet? How does that play into it? How has their process or routine adapted after they were diagnosed with the condition? All of those sorts of things will play into the way that you message and market the product, the way that you communicate with the end customer, the way that the final product is designed, the packaging, all that kind of stuff. So that's how I like to do design.
So it's basically across all of the business functions. So I can see that it's within communications, it's within marketing, it's within like making the actual thing. And it probably has other aspects, other departments involved, because you seem to be studying the entire ecosystem.
And then I haven't even gotten into engineering. Oh my God.
Yeah,
actually
so
getting the thing made, I don't even want to talk about it. It's so upsetting. But
why is it upsetting?
It's painful. Getting anything made is so painful because remember how we were talking about the technical founder who's really, really good at what he or she does. They're completely disconnected from the customer, but they're also geniuses at what they do. And they're the ones who are going to help you get the thing made. You have to actually interact with them and sort of relate to them so that you do something that's actually good for the end customer. And I haven't talked about overseas vendors, for example. So now add that technical founder and then add a time difference of 11 hours and a language barrier and a huge cultural barrier in terms of conventions, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh God, it's a miracle. It is a miracle that anything gets made at all. Let me just put it that way.
So how can you tell us, I don't know, about maybe a simple product and like how does that journey look like? Like how many samples would you get? Like how many samples do you get rejected? Like what does that look like? Just so we understand, I guess, the true cost of doing this. And one of the reasons is like just my own curiosity. I want to understand how much pain and suffering has gone into the things that I'm using around me all the time. But also I think for the business leaders listening to this who, have an innovation project or, maybe a startup founder who has an idea for a hardware startup. And often startup founders they underestimate how difficult hardware is going to be. So
if anybody knew how difficult hardware was, they wouldn't do it. None of you should do hardware. And keep in mind, I am specialized in hardware industrial design. Don't do it. Just don't do it. It's horrible. No, I'm like half joking, but it's really, really, really hard. Anyway, sorry. Continue.
No,
continue your
you're
question.
right, because I know, a few people now who've gone into the hardware world and they age very quickly and they become kind of shadows of their former self. And, if they survive their journey, all of them are kind of haggard and they say, God, this was so difficult. Like, this is so difficult. It would have been much easier to do software. Why the hell am I, why am I doing this with my life? Because I think everybody gets inspired by Steve Jobs and, wants to make the next iPhone. Then it turns out that it's actually really hard.
Look, there are so many layers to this. It's like, I don't even know where to start, but there's just so many layers of logistics and just let's start with just designing one prototype. Even that is difficult. You have to find a vendor. Usually you have to convince them that you'll be able to sell a whole bunch of them. Otherwise, a lot of the times they don't want to waste their time because they know what a pain it is to make hardware. It's what they do for a living. So they're like, well, we only want to work with big companies like Apple or Samsung because they have all of the structures and logistics and supply chain people in place to sort of make this happen. Who the heck are you? Some weird startup guy. So you have to sort of sell them on the idea, which is completely backwards. Imagine trying to you're paying for something, but you have to sell them on letting you be their customer. A lot of the time, not always. It depends on the industry. For like little knickknacks, you can get stuff made pretty easily in China, though. So that's the first step. Actually finding the product market fit, understanding the customer, and making a product that functions at a bare minimum level is pretty incredible, just as a starting point. Now, once you've made one of them, to make tens of thousands of them and actually make a business out of it is even more difficult because now you're introducing variability into the equation. And anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Anything that you could possibly imagine. Even if you do everything perfectly, it'll still probably go wrong because the manufacturer might do something behind your back without you knowing about it. They'll add this little extra spring because it was half of a penny cheaper. They didn't tell you about it, and now you have a huge product recall or an equipment malfunction and it failed the drop test or something like that. I guess a spring wouldn't cause a drop test failure, but you get the idea. The point is it doesn't pass QA.
And that's quality assurance.
Yeah, quality assurance. So it's just, there's so many parts in even the simplest thing that you can imagine. If you guys should look at an iPhone teardown. You can look it up on Google Images or something. Look at how many parts are in that thing. It's absolutely astounding. And every product and object is like that. Even something as simple as a pen. It has a spring inside of it. It has the actual inkwell. The ballpoint pen tip is tolerance to like a fraction of a millimeter. And they have to make millions of these things. They're pumping them out probably hundreds every second. And it has to be absolutely perfectly precise. And that's like a stupid little plastic pen. It's completely insane. It's completely absurd. Like the whole thing is just astounding.
Well, one of my clients, they run a startup, and it hasn't gone public, hasn't gone out to the public yet, so I can't say who it is. But essentially, this person, before they founded this company, they ran supply chain for one of the world's biggest brands, and I have never seen anybody who deals with serious challenges if so kind of easily, because I think when you're dealing with supply chain for a really large company, like you're just so used to horrible things happening all over the time and things just not working, that essentially that just becomes your life. And so it's probably one of my most calm and most peaceful clients, not because what's happening around the startup founder is calm and peaceful, but just because they've just dealt with so many disasters. So startup disaster seems to be completely fine. But I do want to go back to my earlier question: digital versus physical.
Oh yeah, we can talk about that for sure. One last thing: I have a friend who had a shipping container full of his product, and the ship sank.
I saw that on TikTok. I mean, I don't know if I saw that video on TikTok, but for some reason, I'm really into watching videos of really scary waves in the North Sea and barges. Like,
yeah,
I never want to go on one of them, but watching them, it was quite fun. And the latest one that I saw is literally this like massive barge with all of these shipping containers. And these shipping containers, they just fall off like little tiny Lego bricks.
I know, they're little tiny Lego.
Yeah.
And it's gone. Your product's gone. All of that work, all of that money is gone.
That's probably like, I was looking at this, I'm like, that's literally the bottom of the sea. Like, that's not coming back. This is it.
Yeah, so that stuff happens all the time. Okay, so back to the question on design, software design versus hardware.
Yeah.
Okay, so software is definitely, I wouldn't say it's easy. It's not, but at least you don't have to deal with the hardships of supply chain and logistics and, working with overseas vendors, blah, blah, blah. I mentioned this, actually, I think it was my friend Ryan Hume who mentioned this as well. Right, you should interview Ryan Hume. Anyway.
Well, introduce us.
Yeah, I will actually. He's a really smart guy. So I think he was mentioning that a lot of software design. So to preface, a lot of designers have a bit of an ego, and that's because
I saw your video on that. I loved that video. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and there's a good reason. Well, I don't know if it's a good reason, but there is a reason for that. It's really hard to sell somebody on an idea that doesn't exist without any sort of measurable outcome. Usually, if you can say like, look, we can make this 20% more efficient if we do this thing, like as an engineer, it's like, okay, let's do it. That's pretty straightforward, right? But if you're a designer, a lot of it is so abstract and highly subjective. So in order to sell the business guys on it or sell the investors on it or whoever, you kind of have to have a front that sort of makes you seem like, the big genius or whatever. Like you're the creative genius. And a big thing that's associated with that just culturally is just kind of being very short-tempered and the struggling creative genius trope. Mm-hmm. I think the reason for that is, once again, because it's really hard to tie a positive outcome to design ahead of time. It's hard to measure the output as well. Even if you do something great, it's really, really hard to measure if the design is what really sort of put it over the edge.
So essentially what you're saying is that what Steve Jobs is famous for, I mean, he obviously is famous for his amazing flair for design, but also for being very difficult. That essentially he is just typical of people in that job. And the way we in culture see Steve Jobs is like, well, yes, he, denied paternity and was really, really awful to work for, but he was a genius, so it's okay.
I don't think it's okay, just to be clear. I think that Steve Jobs was, he was brilliant, but like, who cares? He was kind of a jerk, honestly. And that's probably blasphemous to say coming from Silicon Valley. In fact, I know there are people probably screaming at me right now through their phones or screens or whatever. But that's really what I think. I think it's totally unnecessary. I understand why people do it. I want to make another thing clear. I don't think it's typical, but I do think it is definitely a designer archetype. There are designers who are like that. I wouldn't even call it common, but there are designers who are like that. I know plenty of designers who are really great and really nice. Yeah. In terms of Steve Jobs, I don't know if you even need to do that. It's just sort of, it's one technique that you can use to sort of sell your vision and get it through. But you have to, another thing is that it's so hard to get anything made that you almost need to be uncompromising and forceful, maybe not with other people, but with sort of making sure that it gets through. So there's a way to do that that isn't rude or aggressive, but the type of person who is going to do that will often have those other negative traits that are associated with persistence and, driven determination, et cetera, et cetera.
So you're saying that essentially, in order to sell investors or a CEO or a CFO, even worse, on a design, if a thing that doesn't exist, people have to really believe in their vision. And sometimes that comes out in the form of them, not being very nice. But in digital design, you don't have that issue. Am I correct?
You have less of it. Digital designers are a lot nicer, and there could be cultural aspects to that, but also it's because you can tie your design work to a measurable outcome because the analytics are just so damn good with software. You can even see, there's like eye tracking. You can see where the person's finger is moving around on the screen in some cases. You have an app, let's say. You change the buy now button from green to red. This is like a common thing. And sales go up 3%. Maybe it's millions of dollars every year. It's like, okay, well, I don't need to have a giant ego or scream at anybody. I can just change the color of the button and there's the outcome. Mm-hmm. So you don't need to rely on the ego as much. But if you're going to do something that's less incremental and more revolutionary, a lot of people tend to adopt the more aggressive approach, which once again, I don't necessarily agree with. And I'm not saying that all people who are really great innovators are like this, but it is something that you'll notice a lot in design circles. I shouldn't even say a lot, sometimes in design circles.
So is it normal for designers to go from the digital design world to the analog one? Or does that not happen? Like, do people go from industrial design to user experience and back and forth, or does that not really happen?
Industrial designers often go to user experience, but usually not the other way around, because industrial design has pretty demanding constraints around 3D CAD modeling and a lot of other very, very technical skills that are not required for UX design. Not to say that UX design isn't hard to do, but the tools, all industrial designers are able to use UX design tools, but not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So an industrial designer could more easily find their way into UX. And that happens quite often. I have never heard of somebody who studied UX design in college, for example, and then went into industrial design, but I've heard of the opposite pretty much all the time.
Interesting. Cool. Well, thank you. And so my one of my last questions for you is, what resources would you recommend to a business audience to learn about design and design thinking? And, I'm going to go first because I would recommend to everybody to watch your channel, Design Theory, which I absolutely love. But apart from that, or maybe there's nothing. But
no, I do. Yeah. The book that we mentioned that you also really like, The Design of Everyday Things, is really good. Mm-hmm. Another one is Designing for Growth. I have it on my bookshelf. That's what I'm looking at. Designing for Growth is another really good one. The one that's more focused on branding is The Brand Gap. Mm-hmm. That's less about design thinking, more about branding, but it is still very relevant. So those are the three ones. I'd say The Design of Everyday Things, Designing for Growth, and The Brand Gap. Those are three really great books that I recommend. My channel's pretty good too. One last thing I want to mention regarding Steve Jobs. It's important to remember that the head of design at Apple, Johnny Ive, he was the lead industrial designer there. Mm-hmm. He's supposedly a very mild-mannered, nice guy. And, he made it to the pinnacle of the field. I think he was a chief design officer, all said and done, at the end of everything. So, you can but I guess maybe he had Steve Jobs sort of paving the way for him. Maybe Steve Jobs was the demolition man and Johnny Ive just sort of calmly, did his thing. But it's important I think there is something to be said for just sort of being respectful in your process and working as a designer. And I think Johnny Ive is an example of somebody who has exhibited those traits at the highest level.
Well, I think now we are in the age of Elon Musk has gone mad, and we're seeing all sorts of, examples of not fabulous behavior from, somebody who should know better, who's old enough to know better. And I am seeing that some people are kind of making this excuse of like, oh, well, he's a genius. And I was recently listening to a podcast about Einstein, who really was a genius. And apparently he was lovely and kind and actually wanted to impart knowledge. And yes, he loved reporters, and he was one of the first kind of big global celebrities, and he definitely courted celebrity. But, he was nice to journalists, and he was generally nice to people. And I think, well, okay, if Einstein, could be nice to people, then the excuse of, oh, well, you're a genius, and so just niceness doesn't come with it, I think it's wrong.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Anyway, so thank you very much. I have many others. Well, John, I'm going to let you go now. Thank you so much. This has been very educational. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I recommend everybody to subscribe to Design Theory.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia. It's been a lot of fun speaking with you. I really liked some of the questions that you asked. I thought they were really fascinating and thought-provoking, so thanks again.
Wasn't that super interesting? I think John is so insightful and also quite fun, which makes him just a pleasure to learn from. And we don't want learning to be boring. It does not have to be boring. And if you enjoyed this episode, I really do recommend that you take this work deeper and learn to apply it to your unique goals. You can do that when you enroll for the Design for Growth program. So do enroll before the early bird rate runs out at the end of December. This program is going to be the perfect way to learn a vital skill set and to begin your year with an ambitious and realistic plan, and also make new connections with smart people around the world. The link to enroll is in the show notes, or just go to techfornontechies.co/events and see all of the information there. And on that note, my dear smart listener, I wish you a wonderful day, a great Christmas if you're celebrating next week, and I will be back in your delightful smart ears next Wednesday. Ciao!